Welcome to the ETF Show, taped here at the Asset TV studios in New York. I'm your host, Kristen Myers, ETF Editor-in-Chief for Asset TV. A potential SpaceX IPO has investor attention turned to the final frontier as space ETFs are flooding the market with inflows to match. Space exploration ETFs raked in $86 million in March alone, bringing year-to-date inflows to $437 million by the beginning of April. Now, the Procure Space ETF, ticker UFO, doubled its size to over $700 million in AUM, driven by $322 million in net inflows since April. Year to date, the fund has pulled in roughly $500 million. Now, to put that into perspective, the fund has raked in just over $650 million since its launch in 2019, showing the clear and explosive interest in space exploration this year. Here to discuss more is Andrew Chanin, CEO of ProcureAM, which again has the Procure Space ETF, ticker UFO. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thrilled to be here.
So I want to start with all of the interest that we are seeing thanks to the upcoming SpaceX IPO. I know that you guys have had a fund since 2019. So how are you thinking about space, really being an investable theme, or those that might say it's still a bit early days for this sector?
So we've been big believers in the space economy for many years now, as you mentioned, and apparently we're a 7-year overnight success. And I think there's been a lot of attention recently, given this IPO, as you mentioned. But for us, there's a lot of transformational technological changes that we've been seeing in recent years that have allowed us to experience this much more expanded space economy that we're enjoying today.
Why do you think the SpaceX IPO has really captured interest in a way that a lot of other space exploration companies haven't?
This has been a truly different company. And part of what got us excited to launch the Space ETF when we did was because of different technological breakthroughs like SpaceX was able to achieve with reusable rockets. So that significantly reduced the cost of accessing space. And that breakthrough has been able to allow us to expand what the space economy is, who can get involved, the cadence and frequency of rocket launches, sending things to space, and it's opened up so many more opportunities. And so this IPO deserves the attention that it's getting and could be truly transformational, not just for the space economy, but for broader markets in general.
Now, do you see this, IPO really bolstering or strengthening the investment case for the sector? Or do you think at all there could be a possibility that it might even overshadow the rest of the industry?
It's tough to say, but this IPO does warrant this attention. We're talking about a company that might be the largest ever IPO'd company, significantly larger than the Ramco IPO several years ago. And this is something that's been very difficult for investors to get exposure to, typically left with the only option being overpriced SPVs if you're able to get access, or other types of funds that might own those SPVs. So for retail investors and institutional investors alike, this may be the first time that they've had the opportunity to actually get pure direct exposure to the company.
So I want to take a step back for a second, because those that don't know might think that investing in space is really just investing in, rockets and spaceships, but that's not entirely true. So what does this sector really encompass?
So for UFO and the index that our fund tracks, you'll see different types of companies, from your large diversified aerospace and defense names to companies that specialize in areas like communications, which has been one of the largest portions of the overall space economy, launch, infrastructure, hardware, and many other things that allow us to either utilize space or to access space.
What parts of the space sector are you really seeing as the strongest commercial adoption for right now?
So, the early days of the space program were heavily government funded. And now this commercial part of space has really grown. So the ways that companies are utilizing uh, space-based assets for communications is very helpful. But because space is much more affordable to access due to reusable rockets, we're seeing many new entrants, which is why we can actually start to have these conversations about data centers in space. But space is truly enabling all different parts of the overall global economy because of connectivity and other things that space allows us to achieve.
Now, I know you mentioned defense, so I'm curious to know how much of the growth story that we're seeing, in this sector is tied to defense, and how much of it is tied to innovation.
The defense side is a must spend now. We know that our adversaries are ramping up their capabilities. Russia, China, and non-adversarial groups like Europe, India, and beyond also have their own space ambitions. So because the moon is so strategic, getting to the moon has become a new space race, as well as accessing low Earth orbit. So we have these different demands that are pulling forward launch and other types of things that we need for building out the next infrastructure iterations for space. And so failure is not really an option. So the military side is very important. Government spending is important. But from the commercial side, what can we do once we can get to Mars? Are we going to be building out permanent habitats? Well, that's what Artemis wants. But if you look at space historically, we've been able to do things for NASA or for other groups and build out those technologies, and they end up having rampant benefits for mankind back here on Earth. So think like GPS that had fairly a singular use originally, and now it's embedded into our smartphones and allowing us to achieve the things we do on a daily basis. So figuring out how we can have dual use cases for many of these technologies could potentially be a huge opportunity for some of these existing space companies today.
So you mentioned before, and I think you called it data centers in space or data centers in the sky. So I'm curious to know if there's a connection between, AI infrastructure and, the broader space economy that investors right now either aren't thinking about at all or perhaps are underappreciating.
So we're hearing from private companies and public companies today that are already developing their solutions, and some already have solutions to be able to help enable the space data center economy, whether that's building out permanent installations on the moon, whether that's having orbiting space stations or even smaller satellites that are helping to enable that. These solutions are being developed, as we speak. The European Space Agency is conducting research to determine how viable this industry is. But there are many problems with building data centers here on Earth, and there are many people that are not in my backyard against data centers in their area. So space becomes a natural extension of what we can do and where we can go. So it's a very real conversation that's happening, and there's a strong belief that some of the proceeds from a SpaceX IPO could be going directly towards data centers in space.
So we talk a lot about how investors really need to understand what's going on under the hood. They really need to be able to kick the tires of any fund. And one of those things is going to be looking at the holdings. So I'm curious to know if you can really sort of describe what qualifies as a space company, because you're mentioning so many sectors, defense, communications, that probably have infrastructure or companies that are tied right back here on Earth. So what exactly qualifies as a space company or a space exploration company for those that actually want to invest in space as a pure play?
So for the holdings of UFO and the index that we track, these are companies that are providing businesses, services, and products that are reliant upon space. So launch is absolutely vital. But if you think about how space enables some of these other areas that people are investing fortunes into, so you talk about AI, big data, connected devices, Internet of Things, autonomous devices, all of these things, including blockchain and cryptocurrency, there's a common thread. And in that case, it's data. And that data is being transferred from point A to point B. And in many cases, space is acting as that digital data toll operator on this digital data superhighway for these companies. So if you really believe in some of these of these other industries, you need to realize how important space is for enabling those different technologies. And I think because many people overlook that, therein lies some of the opportunities that we're seeing being unlocked today.
Okay, so talk a little more about this, because one of the criticisms of thematics is that some of these funds are only loosely tied to the theme. And as you're mentioning, space being really a very large thread for things that are connected to data. So for investors that really want to get into this, whether it's, through UFO or other funds, how can they really make sure that they are more tightly tied to the theme instead of just loosely?
So that was one of the most important parts for me when finding the index that we wanted to track. And so this was co-developed by former director of research for the Space Foundation, an individual that actually helped and is credited with building out the model for the space report, which has historically been one of the most relied upon papers for determining the size and growth of the overall space economy. And so having that insight helping to develop this and to focus on these pure play companies. So at rebalance for the index, at least 80% of the index needs to be pure play space companies, those deriving at least 50% of their revenues from space, while also realizing that some of the major players in the space economy are the more diversified aerospace and defense names, but not wanting those non-space related parts of those businesses to really be what sways the performance of the fund. Those diversified names are capped at up to 20% at rebalance. So what you'll see is a roughly 50 publicly traded companies from around the world specializing in many different areas of the space economy currently in UFO today.
So UFO launched 7 years ago, just had its 7-year anniversary. How has the industry and the sector really changed since the launch of that fund?
So we've seen definitely, volatile times since we launched the fund. There was some initial excitement. And then, back when SPACs started targeting a lot of space companies, people started realizing, hey, this might be an area that there's a lot of demand for. Unfortunately, some of those SPACs did not fare so well. And we saw kind of some doldrums for the space industry where people thought maybe some of these companies were overhyped. But then you saw some tremendous opportunities that presented themselves over just the last 2 years. Unknown names like an AST Space Mobile or EchoStar or Global Star or some of these other satellites and communications connectivity names weren't necessarily household names. And if you look back 2 years to AST Space Mobile and what kind of news came out from them, or EchoStar, a company that people thought, hey, they might have to give back some of their spectrum, they managed to actually do multiple multi-billion-dollar deals to sell that spectrum. And that unlocked all this opportunity, including them receiving from SpaceX some actual SpaceX stock. So some of these companies have just been very misunderstood. Some were rightfully sold off because they weren't necessarily ready for the prime time. But that's why I think diversification is very important for looking at a space, an industry such as space, because there are many different companies. And sometimes you have active managers that are looking at this and they don't understand these companies. They don't know where the opportunities are, which is why having a passive fund that doesn't try to get cute and pick names that are maybe space names or, hey, we really like this name, and then get disappointed when it doesn't achieve what that manager hopes that it will. Passive made a lot of sense for us, and we were thrilled to partner with Vetify to get that space index.
Speaking of, looking for opportunity, we're already seeing a lot of firms rushing to launch products, right, that are going to be tied to the future SpaceX IPO. Leverage ETFs. The company has not yet gone public, for as a reminder for everyone that is watching. So I'm curious to know if you see that as innovation, or do you just think a lot of folks are getting ahead of themselves?
So I'm very used to being first to market and bringing out creative ideas to the ETF marketplace. If you're not aware, I was the sponsor of the world's first cybersecurity ETFs and helped bring out the first cybersecurity ETFs in Europe. I created the world's first junior silver exploration mining ETF, the first AI ETFs, and many others. So I'm used to thought laggards coming up behind us after they realize how great of an idea I've come up with. So none of this is new to me. This was all expected. Maybe for them, they didn't expect it, but we certainly saw it coming over here. And that's why we wanted to be first to bring out a pure play global space ETF such as UFO.
Now, as I mentioned at the top, space trade, a lot of runs, huge runs recently. Curious to know when investors need to start worrying more about valuations, worrying more about that than the long-term story.
It's really tough to say. Certainly this has been, at least for since we've had the fund out, pretty unprecedented times for the overall performance of the space economy. But when you look at what these companies are doing today and what other companies are looking to develop, they're building out the infrastructure for the next iteration of what we can attain in space. So the types of opportunities that those can open as we build out that infrastructure, I don't think anyone really truly understands what those opportunities can be. So the strategic benefits of having our own commercial orbiting space stations, a permanent presence on the moon, our ability to build out and test different robotics and autonomous machines and devices to help us build out that infrastructure. And when you think about space, what does it take to support human life? It's clean air, it's clean water, it's food, it's shelter. And these are all things that we're dealing with issues in different places back here on Earth. So to the extent that we can build those capabilities in space and bring those technologies back here to benefit us here on Earth, we can unlock many different things, even in energy space. So I think people need to have a big imagination and not just say, hey, this is what is happening today, but realize the infrastructure build out today and how we can build off of that and the opportunities that that could present into the future.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions you think that investors still have about the commercial space industry?
I think most people don't truly understand the commercial space industry. And that's why, again, you have those opportunities like you saw several years ago in AST Space Mobile and many of these other companies. And it's because they're misunderstood, it's because they're not household names that people are either not adequately doing the research or they're not doing research on them at all because they're not familiar with them. And that's why having, a diversified basket of right now, 50 or so names, you're getting exposure to many of these different companies even from far places around the world like South Korea and Japan that many people might not be familiar with what those space programs are doing. This is a historically a truly globally collaborative industry. We've also seen in very recent times different countries realizing, hey, we might need our own capabilities and solutions because we might not be able to rely on someone that's our ally today. And so that is forcing real decisions, real strategic build out, and real spending at the government, commercial, and individual level in some cases. And these are real things that are happening today. And it'll be exciting to see what the next wave of space companies are going to allow us to do.
All right, Andrew Chanin, CEO of ProcureAM, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for tuning in to the ETF Show.